Hello and welcome to Servlet tutorial 2. My name is Thakur Arjun Singh. Today we are going to learn Servlet API. In the previous tutorial, we have created one simple Servlet program. Here is the program. Actually, this snapshot of that program. In this program, we have created a first servlet, the user-defined servlet, which extends HttpServlet. So today we are going to learn what is this HttpServlet, what are the interfaces that are being implemented by this servlet, and we are actually going to understand the class hierarchy of this HttpServlet. So before we get started, let's first try to understand how does servlets actually work. So here is the typical request response model. A user is requesting for some web page using the web browser. Here the user typically makes an HTTP request. The request goes to the web server. Here the web server has to identify whether the request is a static request or a dynamic request. Means if the page is some static page, means suppose contact us, so the contact us page usually has some static information. So if the information that the browser is looking for is a static information, then the server will look into its local file system, get the file, and will send the response back to the client with the requested output. Otherwise, if the request is for some dynamic page, say a student is entering his or her roll number and wants his result, so this is actually a dynamic request. So what the web server does, it forwards the request to the web container. Well, the web container in this case will be our Apache Tomcat server that we have configured in our previous video tutorial. So the server will hit the database and get the result, and then will come up with the response, and this response will be converted into HTML output, and then it will be served back to the requester, means to the user. So the dynamic page that the server is producing is internally using Servlet technology. So Servlet actually runs inside this web container or Apache Tomcat. So there may be 10 different servlets to serve 10 different type of requests. So servlets produce dynamic response, and static response is usually produced by some HTML page. Now let's try to understand the Servlet API. In the Servlet API, as you can see, there are a couple of abstract classes, interface, and some concrete classes. We'll start with this servlet. So servlet is an API, and in Servlet API there is an interface called Servlet interface. Basically, Servlet is a small Java program that runs inside the web container and produces dynamic output. But this Servlet interface has a couple of methods that every user-defined servlet should implement. GenericServlet is an abstract class that implements this Servlet interface. So GenericServlet gives implementation to most of the Servlet interface methods, say init method, service method. We will have a look at that in the next couple of minutes. Then we have HttpServlet. See, the GenericServlet is generic. What I mean by generic is that it is not specific to any protocol. It may work on FTP protocol, it may work on HTTP protocol. So HttpServlet extends this GenericServlet. It is again an abstract class, but it provides HTTP protocol specific implementation to the methods of GenericServlet. So usually in 99% of cases we create HTTP servlets because our web applications are usually working on HTTP protocol. And when we created our servlet, in the previous example, we have actually created first servlet. So this first servlet has to implement servlet interface. So we can either implement servlet interface, we can either extend this generic servlet class, or we can simply extend this HttpServlet class. So HttpServlet class provides implementation to most of the HTTP specific methods. So it's always a good idea to extend HttpServlet class instead of extending generic servlet class or implementing servlet interface. So now we will have a look at the different methods that are being provided by servlet interface and all of these classes. So servlet is an interface in the package java.x. So it has a method called init method. Init method returns void, but it takes an argument called ServletConfig argument. ServletConfig is an object that holds the information about servlet's initialization parameter, and it can access all the information about one particular servlet. Suppose there are 10 different servlets in our application, then there will be 10 different servlet init objects, one for each servlet. Then we have service method. Whenever a request is coming from the client, the request need to be serviced. So this service method takes care of that service. Service method takes two different arguments. One is of type ServletRequest, other is of type ServletResponse. ServletRequest object holds the information about the request that is coming from the client, and ServletResponse object holds the information about the response that is to be delivered to the user. Then we have destroy method. So once the servlet is initialized using init method and the request is serviced using service method, destroy method is involved. Remember, init method and destroy methods are called only once, but service method is called for every single request. Means if a user is giving suppose 10 requests, so service method will be called 10 times, but init and destroy methods will be called only once. Next we have getServletConfig. So getServletConfig is like a getter method, and it gives us back the object of servletConfig. So as you can see, the return type is again obviously servletConfig. The other method is getServletInfo, and it returns string, and this method is usually used to get the information about a particular servlet. For example, the copyright information or the author's name of that servlet. Next we have GenericServlet. GenericServlet is an abstract class. It is abstract because the service method of GenericServlet is abstract. This service method is kept abstract because the GenericServlet is generic to all the protocols, and when we give specific implementation to the service method, then that service method will be concrete. Otherwise, in GenericServlet, the service method is always abstract. Again, it has the init method that is coming from the servlet interface itself. It has destroy method, it has service method, and similarly it has ServletConfig method and ServletInfo method. So these are some of the important methods in GenericServlet abstract class. There are some other methods, but we have discussed just these 5 methods. Next we have HttpServlet. This is an abstract class, but there is no abstract method. This class is abstract. What that means that we are not supposed to create its object, but there is no method that is abstract in HttpServlet class. So HttpServlet class has some methods called doDelete, doGet, doPost, doPut. All of these methods take argument there are two arguments. First is HttpServletRequest and other is HttpServletResponse. So these methods are called handler methods. Basically, whenever a service method is invoked, any of these methods will be internally called by the container. But there is no specific implementation for service method. Any of these four methods, or there are other methods also like doTrust method, so they will be called. We will learn about these methods one by one in the subsequent tutorials once we understand the request response model. But for the time being, just remember that this doDelete method deletes some resource from the server. If we want to get some resource, say we want to submit some information and want to get some information back, then we use this doGet method. Similarly, we have doPost method. doPost method is a bit secure than this doGet method. We will learn about the difference between doGet and doPost in our subsequent tutorials. And doPut method, what it does is, whenever a client calls doPut method, some resource will be uploaded to the server. So whenever a service method is called, the service method internally calls one of these methods. We will learn about these methods in more detail in subsequent lectures. Then we have service method. Actually, service method is overloaded in HttpServlet. So it can either have ServletRequest, ServletResponse, or it can either take HttpServletRequest and HttpServletResponse objects. Next, the first servlet, the class we have just created. So it is a concrete class, and as usual it has all the handler methods: doDelete, doGet, doPost, doPut, and also it has the service methods as usual. The service methods that are marked in red, they signify that these methods are not to be overridden. We don't override a service method. We can do that, but this is not recommended because we are supposed to override the handler methods.